Today's shiur is Kesubos Daf Daled. In our previous shiur, we started a Tanaic source of Brisa, and we learned the entire Brisa, of course, but we left off in the middle of a discussion concerning a couple that consummated their marriage, and on the very day that they went to the chuppah, which we call nisuin, the mother of the bride or the father of the groom died. And we saw the sequence of events that we are to follow halachically, as we saw in the source, that they observe a week of festivities that surround the wedding, and only after that do they celebrate or do they practice the week of mourning. Now, during that period of time, the couple, after they had engaged in the bias mitzvah, in the first act of intimacy, they were then to separate, and the man sleeps with other men and the woman with other women. In other words, in separate quarters. They do not stay together as husband and wife for that 2-week period. Today's shiur will begin 9 lines from the bottom of Daf Daled. Omamar, this is a quote from the source, and a little arrow on the side helps you to see where this is coming from. So it said in the source, Hu Yoshen Ben Hanoshim, V'hi Gesheno Ben Hanoshim. As we said, he sleeps amongst other men, and she sleeps amongst other women, indicating that this couple, after the Bio Rishona, they are to separate. Messiah Leila Rabbi Yochanan, this Tanaic source supports Rabbi Yochanan's teaching, the Rabbi Yochanan, even though the law says that one does not practice the acts of mourning, of sadness over the death of an individual, the acts of mourning during a holiday. However, things that are not a public display, things that are of a private nature, as you have here bedroom matters, those are binding. So that we have the first of the 2 weeks is the week of festivity. Nevertheless, even though we categorize that as a holiday of the couple, nevertheless the bedroom behavior is to be practiced as if it were a time of mourning. In fact, technically speaking, after they had their first, after they went to the chuppah, they stood under the marriage canopy and had their act of intimacy. In fact, the relative was buried shortly thereafter. So acts of tzina, of privacy, those are binding even during the festive period. Dorash Rav Yosef Brei Derava Mishmei Derava. Maybe before we go on, we should just note that when we speak about the festive period, the point that Rabbi Yochanan is making is that even when it comes to public holidays, not just a holiday of the couple that just got married, the wedding holiday element, but all of the public holidays that we have on the calendar, the holiday that was, let's say, preceded by a time of mourning, the mourning let's say during, if a person, let us say, suffers a loss during the holiday, so the outward practices of mourning do not take place. They set in only after the holiday, but matters of tzina, of privacy, where you don't have a public expression of mourning, those acts are to be observed even during the holiday. The Gemara continues with Rav Yosef quoting in the name of Rava, Lo shanu elo shelo boal. This halacha of them having to sleep in separate quarters is only if there wasn't the initial act of intimacy, of bias mitzvah. Avol boal, if they had their act of intimacy, then ishto yisheno imo, the husband and wife can sleep together. The wife sleeps with him. The Gemara asks, how can Rava say that? In the Brisa, in the Tanaic source we had just above, we saw that the couple had engaged in their initial act of intimacy, Vikotani, and nevertheless it says, Hu Yashen Bein Hanoshim Vihi Yashena Bein Hanoshim. They are to sleep separately. Now, as we go on in the Gemara, a marking appears, and on the side under the Nosei Mivneh heading, you can see a house shape appears, and this house shape is a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track of a give and take structure. So we saw already the first house marking, which introduced a question, that how can Rava say that if there was bo'al, if there was intimacy, then they can sleep together, when in the source we taught that there was intimacy, and even so, they have to sleep separately. So the house shape with the point facing up represents a kushya, a question, and the inverted house shape, tshuva, a response. This masu maton, this give and take, ad sof omid beis, this is a long give and take that goes till the bottom of the next omid of Gemara. Shem yuad, it's designed, levarer, to clarify, ma yoser chomur be'enei ha'adam. In the eyes of a person, what is considered more stringent? Dine avelus o nida. Laws of mourning, do people take those more seriously, or the laws of nida, the woman who becomes tamea because of her monthly female cycle? That which in the eyes of the individual is considered more stringent. Ein tzorech l'rabonon lahachmir olov. The rabbis don't have to move in to impose additional stringencies. Through imposing different rules and fences. Anyway, a person concerning that which he perceives as more stringent, he will be careful. Now, I know that we didn't say too explicitly yet today, but during the mourning period, a man is not to engage in intimacy. Likewise, when a woman is menstruant, so she is forbidden to her husband in intimacy. We continue now with the Gemara. We saw that Rava told us that if the couple this newlywed couple had consummated their marriage through intimacy, then the need for sleeping separately during this mourning period is not necessary. The Gemara asks, how can you say that it's not necessary when the source itself taught under circumstances of the initial act of intimacy having taken place, and still we insisted on the couple remaining separate? Maybe just to say the obvious, a couple, a newlywed couple, can imagine a man and a woman. They are full of fondness for one another. Some people use the term they're in love with one another. There is the desire for physical contact, and now we are confronted with a situation of mourning where physical intimacy is prohibited. One has to appreciate there is a difference in the psychology of people between a couple that is never experienced intimacy with one another, and all of the anticipation and emotions that precede the actual physical act, as opposed to a couple that are after the fact, that had intimacy with one another. One has to consider, how much control, how much self-control can you expect of a person if he never had experienced this with his newly married wife? So, bearing that aspect of things in mind, we continue with our Gemara. The question has already been raised: how can Rava say that the need for sleeping separately is only if they didn't have intimacy, when the source taught that even if they did have intimacy, there's need for them to be separate? The Gemara answers, Ki Ko'omar, Rava's teaching of the need for being separate, and is only if they didn't have intimacy, but if they did, so they can be together. So that teaching of Rava, that if there was Bo'al, they don't have to be separate, that's a Pirsa Ishto Nida. If you see, we have a little arrow to the right-hand side of the Gemara text, just skim up until you find the preceding arrow, and then in the source it said, likewise with a case of a woman, as they entered the chuppah, she became a nida, so they have to sleep separately. So Rava's teaching of the distinction between Bo'al and no Bo'al is only referring to that case of Pirsa Ishto Nida. That, namely, that if he was Bo'al, if they had intimacy, so they don't have to remain separate. And now, as opposed to Avelus, where even if Bo'al, even if they had intimacy, they must remain separate. The Gemara asks, Ha v'chein kotani. In the source, again, we have the line where the arrow appeared above. We had squiggle underlined the word v'chein. The word v'chein appears, which is mashma, which implies that the din of nida is the equivalent, the same as the din of avelus. And therefore, there would be the need for sleeping separately, even if Bo'al, also in the case of nida. So to explain that Rava's distinction between Bo'al and lo Bo'al is applicable only to the case of Pirsa Ishto Nida, that doesn't seem to be the spirit of the source, which equated Pirsa Ishto Nida with the laws of Avelus. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Gemara responds, Hochi Ko'omar. Thusly, we are to appreciate the source and preserve Rava. You asked about the word v'chein, so the source is to be learned as follows. V'chein mi shepirsa ishto nida v'lo Bo'al. If you have the woman becoming a nida and there had not been any initial intimacy, then hu yoshen bein hanoshim v'ishto yeshena bein hanoshim. So that in the case of nida plus factoring in lo Bo'al, then it's like the way we deal with the case of the mourning, that they must sleep in separate quarters. However, we must add, if there was Bo'al with the case of Pirsa Ishto Nida, there had been an initial intimacy, as a result of the stringency of Nida, we don't have to keep the couple separate, away from one another. A man and a woman, they know how severe a violation it would be if in a state of menstruancy they would cohabit. They will know how to exercise self-restraint, and if before she became a nida they had experienced intimacy with one another, we don't have to keep the couple separate. Now, just to repeat ourselves, that is true with nida. However, with regard to mourning, even if they did have intimacy with one another, we must keep them separate. Why is that? So, as we said before, we gave the, let's say, psychological introduction. In the eyes of people, nida is a stringent realm, therefore they'll automatically exercise self-restraint. Mourning is a lenient realm, and therefore they won't exercise self-restraint. And therefore, even if they had experienced intimacy with one another, they still must be kept separate. And he sleeps in a separate quarters with other men, and she sleeps in a separate quarters with other women. Well, this gives rise to a question. Notice we have a long question marking. L'meimra da avelus Kilo le minida, is this to suggest that in the eyes of people, mourning is a lighter matter than nida, and therefore we, the rabbis, have to impose additional restraints in the case of mourning. Ve'omar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina Amar Rav Huna Kol melochis sheisha oisa l'bayla nida oisa l'bayla. The words nida and a few lines later avelus are highlighted with a diamond marking. These are the two topics we're dealing with right now. Rav Huna tells us that all things, all services that a woman ordinarily does for her husband, a nida also can do for her husband. Chutz mi mezigas hakois v'atzoas hamita v'harchotzes ponav yodav raglov, with the exception of her pouring wine for him to drink, or her preparing the bedding for her husband. That's hatzoas hamita, setting up the bedding, the spreading of sheets, and the washing of his face, arms, and legs. We want to minimize these acts because there's a certain element of drawingness or affinity or attraction that these particular acts can be characterized with. And we don't want attraction that could lead to intimacy. So we say that these things the nida should not do. But all other activities that a woman ordinarily does for her husband, the nida is allowed to do. V'ilu gabi avelus tanya. Now, in contrast, with regard to avelus, mourning, we have the following source. Even though it has been said that a man cannot force his wife, who is, we're dealing again with there's an issue of mourning here, so that he can't force his wife to. Kocheles and pokesis, these are different forms of, let's say, cosmetics. That he can't force his wife to get made up. Be'emes omru, mozeges lo hakois, umatzas lo hamita, umarchetzes lo iponov yodav raglov. Again, there is mourning taking place, and we said that we have to keep the couple apart from intimacy, no intimacy during mourning period. What, however, do we see over here? We allow the pouring of the wine, the making of the beds, and the washing of the face, arms, and legs. Now, from the fact that we allow these things during the time of mourning, and we are not fearful of them engaging as a result of these acts in intimacy, it must be that they perceive mourning as a more severe violation. If one, let's say, intimacy during mourning is perceived as a more severe matter in their eyes than we find by nida. So this brings into question what we argued at the top of the Amid. The top of the Amid, we try to demonstrate that nida is perceived as a more stringent realm as opposed to mourning. And here, in developing this question, we see that mourning is perceived as a more stringent realm, and hence the rabbis don't have to impose additional harchokis. Harchokis says that different acts of different restrictions don't need to be imposed in the case of mourning, because people will exercise self-restraint anyway because they perceive mourning as a more severe realm. So how do we resolve this seeming contradiction? Lo kashi, there is no contradiction. Kan bavelus didei, kan bavelus didah. The distinction is with regard to who is in fact the mourner. If the husband, avelus didei means he is in mourning, the husband is in mourning, So there we insist on the separate sleeping quarters. When he is mourning, so that is not there is not sufficient deterrent by the fact that he is mourning to keep him away from his wife if we were to allow them to sleep in the same quarters. So when it comes to Avelus today, that's the source in which we saw they must be in separate quarters. Kan Bavelus Didah, the source that indicated that we don't have to exercise restraint with regard to mourning, that's when the wife is mourning. When the wife is mourning, so we say she can fill a cup of wine for her husband, and she can make the beds, and she can wash his face, feet, and legs. Now, if that's going to lead to attraction, since she is mourning, she'll keep him away. So there's no fear of intimacy resulting from these other acts that otherwise could be viewed as acts of attraction. We should glance at Rashi just a couple lines up. Kan b'avelus didei la'olam avelus kilo le minida. In general, mourning is viewed lighter than nida. V'hani masnisa hachi mitartzen. The Tanaic sources that we have learned are to be resolved as follows. The source that indicated that during mourning they must sleep separately, that's Ba'avelus Didei. That's when he is in a state of mourning. The source that indicated that we don't have to impose additional restrictions with mourning, that's Bavelus Dida. That's when she is mourning. Koi. Tikotoni, Ein Odom Rashoy Lahu v'chulei. That very same source told us that a man can't force his woman to get made up. What's the issue that she shouldn't get made up? She is in mourning. She doesn't want to apply all these cosmetics. And the reason for our being lenient and allowing her to fill up, when she is mourning, she can fill up a cup of wine for her husband. If he is overcome with passion and wants intimacy with her, but she's mourning. Since she is in mourning, she will not yield to his passion, and therefore we're not running a risk by allowing her to do these acts of mezigas kos and matatsos mita. Now we turn back to the Gemara. Question: Aviv shel chosan oi imo shel kala katani. In the source that we saw in Omid Aleph, we saw actually an equation made between his Avelus and her Avelus, because the source taught where his father died, father of the groom, or the mother of the bride. So we see that even when she is in Avelus, we should apply restrictions. So let's read that line again. Aviv shel chosan o imo shel kala kotani. The Gemara answers, Ki kotoni ash'ora. The source that made an equation when it said also imo shel kala, that's ash'ora on the other halachas. The other halachas which mentioned the moving of the body into a separate room. This is what we saw in the original source, that if you have a new couple, and all the food was prepared, and the source taught us the order of events that will end up first having the bias mitzvah, and then with the week of festivities followed by the week of mourning. That with regard to that, we said machnis the mace to a separate room. We placed the body of the deceased in a separate room. With regard to those procedures, there we equate the avelus of the man with the avelus of the woman. The Gemara asks a question. Omi shani bein avelus didei lavelus dida? Is it really so? Is it really accurate to say that there are differences between the husband being in mourning versus the wife being in mourning? V'atanya mi shemes chomiv oy chamoisai. A person whose father-in-law or mother-in-law died. Now we wrote above that if it's a man's father-in-law, it means the wife is in mourning. It's her father or mother that died. He cannot force her to get made up. Rather, he inverts his bed. This idea of kfiyas hamita is characteristic of mourning as far as the Gemara law is concerned. So he is to invert his bed as well, and he practices avelus together with her. V'chein he shemes chomia oy chamosa. Likewise, she whose father-in-law or mother-in-law died. Now, when we speak about a woman's father-in-law or mother-in-law who is in mourning, the man, the husband, is in mourning. So we say likewise when he is in mourning, Eino rasha lios kecheles v'los pokeses. She is not allowed to get made up. Ela koifa mitasa v'noyeges imoy avelus. She inverts her bed and observes together with him mourning. So as we read this source, it seems that the mourning of the woman is equated with the mourning of the man. So the Gemara says, Tani ba'avelus didei, you have to, they'll say, insert that with regard to when he is in mourning, hu yoshen bein hanoshim, v'ishto yeshena bein hanoshim. So that we do find a distinction with regard to his being in avelus as opposed to her being in avelus. When he is in avelus, so then we insist on them sleeping separately. But in the source, you can see we have a little arrow, and you can align this arrow with arrow a few lines up. We saw the word v'chein in the source. That indicates that we compare, like as we said in the beginning, we say here as well. And in the beginning we spoke about she being, the wife was in avela, she was in mourning. Likewise, when he is in mourning. So the Gemara says, Ki kotoni, the source, when it teaches we'll say this equivalency, that's akichol va'pirchos. That's with regard to her getting made up. Just like when she is in mourning, so she doesn't get made up. So to when he is in mourning, so it's on that score that we compare them. The Gemara asks, V'ha imoi kotoni, my lav imoi b'mita. But in the source, it said imo. That means that when he is an ovel, notice the little arrow to the left-hand side of the Gemara. This points up to a line, just a couple lines up, where he was described as being a mourner, and it says his wife is noheges with him avelus. Now, what does that word imo imply? The word imo implies that they are together in the bed, as husband and wife are together, not in separate quarters. So we see that even when he is in mourning, he is trustworthy. We rely on him to maintain self-restraint. So that this again flies in the face of the attempt we made above to make a distinction between his being a mourner versus her being a mourner. Lo, the word imo doesn't imply that when he's a mourner they sleep together. Rather, babayas. The word imo means together with him, that she observes acts of mourning together with him when they're in the house together. As Rav said to his son, apparently his Rav's daughter-in-law became a mourner. So Rav said to Chia, his son, when you're in front of her, so observe practices of a mourner. But when you're not in front of her, when you're outdoors, you don't have to observe the behavior of the acts of mourning. But just to review the main point, but as far as allowing the couple, when one of them is in mourning, to be in the same room, the same bedroom, there is a distinction between when he is in mourning, we will keep them separate, versus when she is in mourning, we don't. We continue. Rav Ashi, notice this is a long comment of his. Rav Ashi Omar. Now we're continuing with the marking, presenting Rav Ashi also as a response to the matter. Rav Ashi Omar mi kol medamis avelusa dahacha avelusa da'alma. How can you even begin to compare the topics of a newlywed couple? Avelusa dahacha means the mourning over here. Over here means in our original sugya, our original topic, dealt with a newlywed couple, and in the course of our give and take in the Gemara, we bring in laws concerning mourning in general. The mourning in general, which featured the laws of pouring a cup of wine and making the beds and washing hands, face, and then feet. The laws of Avelis, as they apply to a newlywed couple, are different than the laws that apply to a couple that's been married already. Avelusa di alma chomir v'lo asi lezilzuli bei. Avelus in general is perceived with stringency in the eyes of the public, and therefore we can, as we say, we can allow acts that have a certain attractive nature to be practiced, pouring of the wine, making of the bed, and we're not fearful that that's going to lead to an actual intimacy, the overcoming of one's passion. We're dealing with a couple that's already experienced that. They've been together for a while. So that in the eyes of such a couple, the laws that the laws that apply to Avelus, specifically intimacy, is perceived with due stringency. Hence, we don't have to impose additional acts of distancing. The distancing the couple from one another. And the translation below also, they won't come to treat it lightly. Avelus dahacha, however, when it comes to the newly married couple, kevon de'akilu rabbanon, since we demonstrated a certain level of leniency, the next line the Gemara is going to ask, what on this line the Gemara says, what do you mean leniency? But for the time being, with regard to Chassid and Kala, the newlywed couple, since this couple has seen leniency with regard to their position, Asi l'zilzuli bei, if we allow them to sleep together, there's a great chance, just like we were lenient with regard to one aspect of their life together, with regard to mourning and the Chassid and Kala, we're fearful that they'll be lax with regard to conducting intimacy with one another as well. My kula, and here the Gemara explains. You can see we have a double underline, which is a series marking to feature the different stages, the several stages, till we can define what the kula is. So this is stages to be mavarer. What is the leniency that was just referred to? My kula ilay motikotani boyel bilas mitzvah uporesh. If the leniency is with regard to our allowing the first act of intimacy, the bias mitzvah, to take place, and then they separate from one another, and that's viewed as an act of leniency with regard to the laws of mourning, when you're dealing with a couple whose relative just died. Hasam, there it's not a function of our being lenient with regard to the laws of mourning. There it's different. Mishum delo chol alav avelusa. The laws of Avelus didn't even begin. If they're not mourners yet, so of course they can conduct an act of intimacy. And what do you mean that the laws of mourning didn't start yet? Isn't it so that their relative just died? Yeah, but it's not the death of the relative per se that imposes the laws of mourning. I l'Rebbe Eliezer ad sheyetzeh mipesach habayis, I l'Rebbe Yoshua ad sheyistam hagoylel. As far as when do the laws of mourning set in, according to Rebbe Eliezer, they set in at the point that the body is carried out of the house, which is not the case with our newlywed couple. We simply put the body in a separate room, but we don't carry him out of the house. According to Rabbi Yeshua, when do the laws of mourning set in? Yishtam hagoylel, when the grave is covered. Prior to the covering of the grave, the laws of mourning haven't yet set in. So that which we allow this couple, one of whom had the passing of their close relative, when we allow them to engage in intimacy, that's not because we're lax, we're lenient with regard to the laws of mourning. They're not even mourning yet. Hello? So what was meant earlier when we said that with regard to Chosin and Kala, why do we have to keep them separate? Because we've already been lax or lenient with the laws of mourning. With regard to what? Hello, de Kotoni. Noyeg Shivas Yemei Hamishte V'achakach Noyeg Shivas Yemei Avelus. The fact that we see that the 7 days of wedding festivity precede the 7 days of mourning, that creates a sense of, we'll say, lightness with regard to the way people perceive the laws of Avelus. And this statement is only in the context of the Chosin and Kala. Hence, with regard to the Chosin and Kala, we saw the source insisting on them sleeping separately. However, as far as Rav Ashi is concerned, if it's a couple not newlywed, there people will exercise the necessary self-restraint, even when the husband is an ovel, and that helps to explain that there's no contradiction in the sources. Before we continue in the Gemara, we glance at the side where we have our Nosei Mivneh heading. A bow tie shape appears. This highlights Te'omim She'ein Boyelim Bila Rishona B'Motzoi Shabbos. In our source that we saw quoted back on Omid Aleph, it was revealed that the initial act of intimacy with regard to a new couple should not take place, in the source it mentioned, not on Friday night, as a result of creating an injury, a chabura, causing a blood flow to take place, which is characteristic of the first act of intimacy with a virgin girl, and causing chabura, blood flow on Shabbos, is forbidden. And also not to have the first act of intimacy take place on Motzoi Shabbos. If they hadn't engaged in intimacy before that, they shouldn't do it on Motzoi Shabbos either. That we haven't explained yet. Why is that forbidden? So we see there are two bow tie shapes, and they introduce two approaches. Truth is, we can present it as two stages in Rabbi Zera. In both stage 1 and 2, you see Rabbi Zera's name is highlighted. So now the Gemara text. Second line from the bottom. Omar Mar. Ben kach u ben kach lo yivol b'erev Shabbos v'lo b'motzoi Shabbos. There should be no first act of intimacy on Friday night nor on Saturday night. Bishlomo b'erev Shabbos mishum chabura. I understand that on Friday night they shouldn't have their first act of intimacy because of the problem of a chabura, creating an injury, creating a blood flow. Elo b'motzoi Shabbos amaylo. What's wrong with having the first act of intimacy on Saturday night? Omar Rebbe Zera. We continue at the top of Hey Omar Aleph. Mishum cheshboinus. Rashi at the top. Mishum cheshboinus shim yichnos l'motzoi Shabbos. If they have their first act of intimacy on Saturday night, yasesuda b'layla. There was a practice in the time of the Gemara of a festive meal being made in honor of the act of the first intimacy. And we're afraid that he might make this meal on Saturday night. And he'll start making cheshbonos or calculations on Shabbos of what he has to expend. And we learn from the Pasuk in Yeshaya that one must curtail his Shabbos conversations to, we'll say, Shabbos-related matters, mitzvah-related matters, not financial discussions. And it seems that if we would have the Bia Rishona take place Motzei Shabbos, he is going to be preoccupied with all kinds of expenditures concerning the meal that he would have to make Saturday night after they have their first act of intimacy. A long question is presented, and as a result of this long question, we have to come up with a new explanation. And that's, if you skip the bracketed section, you can see Elo Omer Rabbi Zera. Rather, Rabbi Zera says, Gzero Shemo Yishchod Ben Of. We're afraid that if we allow Bio Rishona on Saturday night, the fellow on Shabbos itself, he's going to come to slaughter a Ben Of, some chickens, for the festive meal. And of course, on Shabbos, slaughtering animals is strictly forbidden. And all of this is a result of what would have been the first act of intimacy on Saturday night. So what do? We preempt this situation by restricting. There's not going to be any act of intimacy first act of intimacy on a Saturday night. Now, in the meantime, of course, you can see we have this long question, and we skipped a section of Gemara that we have in brackets, plus a little more. But let's now go back to the Gemara text. Omar le Rabbi Abaye. Abaye says to Rabbi Zera, Cheshbonos shel mitzvah miasiri. Cheshbonos, calculations concerning mitzvah-related matters. And here you have a meal that's called a sudas mitzvah. This is a mitzvah to have festivities concerning the first act of intimacy and the consummation of this new couple's marriage. So the meal is associated with a mitzvah. Are calculations that are mitzvah-related forbidden? The HaRav Chisdov, Rav Hamnuna, Damichrayu both say Cheshbonos shel mitzvah mutu l'chashon b'Shabbos. Calculations that are mitzvah related, one is allowed to calculate on Shabbos. That's not considered a violation of the spirit of Shabbos, of the laws of Shabbos. And in this long bracketed section, there are simply many examples of that. The reason we have the brackets is to indicate that the main question has already been presented. Namely, if according to Rabbi Zera, the problem with Bio Rishona on Motzei Shabbos has to do with his making calculations regarding expenditures for that meal, but that meal is a mitzvah type meal. Therefore, the calculations are allowed. Within the bracketed section, you'll see a number of examples which are introduced with a double underline. On the side of the Gemara, you notice we have a mivneh, structural note, and the double underline represents sidra shel dugmois shel cheshbonos shel mitzvah, a series of examples of mitzvah calculations, the mutar l'chashon Shabbos, that are allowed to be made on Shabbos itself. So let's go through the bracketed section. V'omar Rabbi Ozer, poiskin stoka laniyan b'Shabbos. One can impose a type of, we'll call it, charity tax in order to subsidize the poor on Shabbos, so that the calculations that are associated with how much each person is going to pay for tzedakah, that calculation can be made on Shabbos. And you'll notice we have a dashed underline highlighting the word Shabbos each time, because that's the point of this entire section, that these are allowed to be done on Shabbos. V'Omer Rav Yankiv, Omer Rav Yochanan, Holchon lebotei knesios lebotei midrashos, lefakeach al iskei rabim b'Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan says that people can assemble in shuls and in study halls. L'fakech al iskei rabim. This has to do with the public getting together to devise different types of solutions for public needs issues. So matters that are of benefit to the public, the community can gather on Shabbos to figure out ways to improve communal matters. The Omar Rabbi Yankiv Bar Idi Omar Rabbi Yochanan Mefakhin Pikuach Nefesh b'Shabbos. One can develop ways of saving lives on Shabbos. Omar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmeni Omar Rabbi Yonasan Holchin L'Tartares L'Karkoyes L'Fakech Iskei Rabim b'Shabbos. People can go to tartios and karkos, or theaters, and possibly circuses. Rashi says tartios are palte melachim v'shiltonim. These are palaces, kings' palaces, and palaces of the rulers for developing methods and ways for the public benefit. V'tona debei Menashe. And in the yeshiva of Menashe, the following sources taught: Mishatchin al hatinoikis liores b'Shabbos. Mishatchin has to do with pairing up a couple, a new couple, children, in anticipation of their marriage. So the shidduch process, the pairing up, consultations, investigations, whatever is required for pairing up to in anticipation of marriage, is allowed to be done on Shabbos. What else? V'al hatinok l'lamdo sefer l'lamdo umnis, and calculations for hiring someone to teach a child, to educate a child. That's lamdo sefer, literally teach him the book. It means calculations needed for educating the child, or for even teaching him a craft. If you have to hire someone, how much is someone going to pay? And you have to discuss money matters, financial matters surrounding this issue of providing education and training a child in a craft. All of these calculations can be made on Shabbos. So, Biyom Rishon Motzoi Shabbos, to be restricted because of calculations that are going to be made regarding the expenditures of the meal that needs to be prepared straight off after Shabbos, that would not be reason enough to restrict Biyom Rishona on Motzoi Shabbos. Elo Omer Rabbi Zera, Gzero Shemo Yishchod Ben Oif. If we allow Biyom Rishona, which, as we said already a number of times, is accompanied by a festive meal, if we allow that first act of intimacy to take place Motzei Shabbos, the fellow might very well slaughter chicken on Shabbos in anticipation of the meal. He'll be so involved with this meal, he'll forget it's Shabbos, and he'll slaughter chicken to be ready for the festive meal Motzei Shabbos. Omar le Abaye. Abaye again challenges Rabbi Zera. He says, Elo me'ato, using this kind of logic, Yom HaKippurim shechalios b'sheni v'Shabbos. If Yom Kippur falls out on a Monday, in other words, Sunday night is the beginning of Yom Kippur. Sunday night is the beginning of Yom Sheni, of Monday. There's a mitzvah to eat on the day before Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei. We are commanded to have a meal on the 9th of Tishrei. So if Yom Kippur comes out on a Monday, the 9th of Tishrei is on a Sunday. So if you have a situation like that, then we should set up the calendar in such a way that Yom Kippur will, in other words, let's say we'll extend the month before by one day, so that Yom Kippur, instead of falling out on a Monday, should fall out on a Tuesday. Now, we didn't explain, though, enough. What happens if it falls out on Monday? So we said you have to have a festive meal or a big meal in anticipation of the fast on Sunday. But is it not so that if you have to prepare a meal on Sunday, you might end up shechting the chickens on Shabbos? So because of this fear that you might come to shecht chickens on Shabbos, if Yom Kippur comes out on a Monday, because of the meal that you have to prepare for Sunday, so should we not push off Yom Kippur by one day and have it come out, instead of on a Monday, have it come out on a Tuesday? Let's read that in the Gemara text again. Yom Kippur shechalios b'sheni b'Shabbos yidocheh. It should be pushed off till Tuesday. Gzeiro shema yishchot ben of, because of the fear of if Yom Kippur would fall out on a Monday, and on Sunday you're commanded to have an erev Yom Kippur meal. When are you going to prepare? You're going to end up shechting the bird on Shabbos. So in order to prevent that from happening, we should push off Yom Kippur by a day. We don't do that. The Gemara answers, Hasam dilinafshe lo torid. When it comes to the Yom Kippur issue, it's a question of you're preparing the meal for yourself. So when a person has to prepare things for himself, he'll do it the last minute also. He's not so preoccupied with making a good impression on his surroundings, and therefore he'll do things the last minute. He won't shecht the bird. He won't slaughter the chicken on Shabbos. However, here when you're dealing with this seudas nisuin, this meal concerning surrounding the Bia Rishona, who comes to the meal? Others. People are invited to this meal, and since you have to make a good impression, make sure everything is set up on time and all in the proper way, he'll be so preoccupied with that he'll forget it's Shabbos. And he'll shecht the bird on Shabbos. He'll slaughter the chicken on Shabbos. Why? Because he's lachir. It's for others. It's the meal for others that are invited. Inami, another distinction. Hasam, when it comes to Yom Kippur, coming out on a Monday, is le revocha. He has a lot of time. He has all of Sunday, or almost all of Sunday, starting from Saturday night till the morning hours of Sunday. He's got enough time. Revocha means space. He's got enough space time-wise. He's not so pressured, and therefore we're not fearful that he's going to, because Yom Kippur comes out on a Monday, that he's going to slaughter the chicken on Shabbos. However, with the Bia Rishona taking place on Saturday night, when is the meal made? For when is the meal made? The meal is made for that very Saturday night. Less lay revacha. He doesn't have any time flexibility. And as a result of that, what happens? He'll be pressured and end up slaughtering a bird on Shabbos. And therefore, we don't want to have the Bia Rishona on Saturday night. Now that you've come up with this analysis, Erev Shabbos Nami, we will prevent Bia Rishona on Friday night. Why? If we allow Bia Rishona Friday night, even without the Chabura explanation, the problem of the blood flow starting on Shabbos, nevertheless, we're still afraid. There's still another consideration. That is this consideration of him being so pressured in time to have a meal ready that Friday night, he'll end up shechting a chicken on Friday night, which is when after Shabbos is already set in. So, as you can see, we were dealing in our last discussion with why is Bia Rishona prohibited on Saturday night, and we started off with Rabbi Zera saying that it had to do with that would lead to making cheshbonis on Shabbos, but we rejected that because cheshbonis shel mitzvah are allowed. That led us to the second stage of Rabbi Zera, where if we allow Bia Rishona on Saturday night, he might come to slaughter a chicken on Shabbos because of the pressure he feels for making that meal, and he'll come to forgetting it's Shabbos. And with that Svara, we're able to explain why Bia Rishona on Friday night is also to be restricted, because of this problem of Shemo Yishchot Ben Of.